Chapter 6, Casanova. Chapter 6. Almost as soon as I stepped ashore, I went to Signora Orio's house, but I found it empty. A neighbor told me she had married Signor Rosa and that they were living in his house. I went there immediately. She told me that Nanetta had become Countess R, and was living in Gusatala with her husband. As for Martina, she had been touched by grace and was now a nun. A few days later, having handed in my resignation and sold my commission for 100 sequins, I took off my uniform and became my own master again. I was now obliged to take up a trade in order to earn my living. I chose that of professional gambler, but Lady Luck had other ideas. She abandoned me after my first few steps in that direction, and a week later I found myself penniless. What was I to do? I had to make a living, so I became a fiddler, using the skill I had learned from Dr. Gozzi. Signor Grimani gave me a position in the orchestra of his Teatro San Samuel, where I managed to earn a living while awaiting better days. I no longer set foot in the respectable houses I had frequented before I sank so low. I was, no doubt, despised, but I was consoled by my realization that I was not despicable. If I had continued to seek my fortune in the military position, I would have needed a kind of patience to which I could make no claim, for I was revolted by all injustices and constraint was intolerable to me as soon as I became aware of it. I was revolted by all injustices, and constraint was intolerable to me as soon as I became aware of it. By playing the violin, I was able to support myself without anyone's help, and I have always considered a man fortunate if he can boast of being self-sufficient. I soon began to adopt the habits of my coarse comrades. After the performance, we would sit in a cabin until we were drunk, then go off to spend the night in a brothel. If we found the place already occupied, we would drive the occupants away, and after forcing the unfortunate victims of deprivation to submit to our brutality, we would sometimes cheat them of the paltry wages assigned to them by law. We would often spend entire nights roaming through the different quarters of the city, inventing and carrying out all sorts of impudent pranks. One of our favorite pastimes was to untie gondolas and let them drift down the canal, enjoying the owner's curses in advance. We would wake up midwives and tell them to hurry to the house of some lady who was not even pregnant. We did the same thing with doctors, making them run half-dressed to the house of some great nobleman who was in perfect health. The priests also had their turn. We would send them to some husband who was sleeping peacefully beside his wife and had very little interest in their extreme unction. If we saw an open door, we would creep into the house and suddenly terrify the sleepers by shouting that the door of their house was open. We were overjoyed whenever we could enter Belfry. We would then alarm the entire parish by sounding a tocsin as though some terrible fire had broken out. We would then cut the bell ropes so that the church wardens would be unable to summon the faithful to Mass the next morning. Complaints came in from all over the city, but we were not worried by all the efforts made to catch us. We were not tempted to be indiscreet. However, for we would have been sent to prison if we had been arrested. We were not tempted to be indiscreet, however, for we would have been sent to prison if we had been arrested. There were 7 of us, and sometimes 8, since I occasionally allowed my brother Francesco to take part in our nocturnal orgies. One night during the Carnival of 1745, all 8 of us were wandering through the streets wearing masks and trying to invent some new prank when we entered a cabaret to have a drink. It was empty except for 3 men who were peacefully conversing with a young and pretty woman as they emptied their bottle. Our leader, a noble Venetian of the Balbi family, said to them, "By order of the council, come with us immediately without making the slightest sound. As for you, Signora, you have nothing to fear. You'll be taken to your home." 2 of our companions took the woman off to a place which our leader had specified in advance, and we seized the 3 men who, trembling, made no resistance. We led them to a gondola, floated down the canal for a quarter of an hour, and then released them. Next, we went to the place where my brother and another member of the gang were waiting for us with the pretty woman who was in tears. "Don't cry," said Balbi to her. "We won't harm you." "Where's my husband? Where's my husband?" "You'll see him again tomorrow morning." Consoled by this promise, she went with us to an inn where we had a good fire made for us in a bedroom on the 3rd floor. We then took off our masks. The sight of 8 young, fresh faces made our beautiful captive feel more at ease, and our gallant manners reassured her. Encouraged by the good food and wine we had ordered and prepared by our words and a few kisses, she saw clearly what was awaiting her and appeared to resign herself to it with good grace. Our leader began the proceedings and persuaded her to overcome her natural reluctance to consummate the sacrifice in such numerous company. The offering must have pleased her, for when I presented myself as the 2nd worshipper, she received me with a kind of gratitude, and she could not conceal her joy when she saw that she was destined to make us all happy. After this noble exploit, we put on our masks again and took the happy victim to her home. You may judge whether or not we felt like laughing when she bade us good night and thanked us with utter sincerity. 2 days later, 2 days later, the husband and his two friends complained to the Council of Ten. The tribunal promised a reward of 500 ducats to anyone revealing the identity of the criminals, even if he was one of their number. None of us turned traitor, although we were all poor, but fear produced a salutary effect, and we did not renew our nocturnal disorders. Toward the middle of April 1746, Signor Girolamo Cornaro married a young lady of the Soranzo family, and I had the honor of attending the wedding celebration as a fiddler. I was a member of one of the many orchestras playing for the balls giving during 3 consecutive days in the Soranzo mansion. And an hour before dawn, during the third ball, I began to feel very tired and abruptly left the orchestra to go home. As I was walking down the stairs, I noticed a red-robed senator who had just dropped a letter when he took his handkerchief from his pocket. I picked it up and handed it to him as he was climbing into his gondola. He thanked me and asked me where I lived. When I told him, he offered to take me there in his gondola. I accepted with gratitude and sat down beside him. A moment later, he told me his left arm felt numb and he asked me to shake it. I shook it with all my might, but soon he murmured that the numbness was spreading all up and down the left side of his body and that he felt as though he were dying. Realizing that he was suffering from a stroke of apoplexy, I ordered the gondoliers to let me go ashore to bring a doctor. I leapt out of the gondola, went into a cafe to ask the address of the nearest doctor, ran to his house, pounded the door, and forced him to come with me in his dressing gown. He bled the senator while I tore my shirt to make bandages. When this operation was finished, I ordered the gondoliers to row at top speed. A short time later, we reached the senator's house in Santa Marina. I woke up the servants and we carried him to his bed unconscious. I sent for a doctor who immediately bled him again. An hour later, 2 patricians, friends of the senator's, came in and questioned me about his illness. I told them everything I knew, recommended that no other visitors be allowed to enter. The 2 patricians and I remained at the senator's bedside. At noon, we silently ate a light dinner without leaving his room. That evening, the elder of the 2 patricians told me that if I had something else to do, I could leave, because he would spend the night on a mattress in the senator's bedroom, and I will spend it in the same chair beside his bed, I replied, because he'd die if I went away. I'm certain he'll live as long as I'm here. They were naturally taken aback by this sententious reply and looked at each other in surprise. During supper, the 2 gentlemen told me without my Having asked them that the senator was Signor Bragadino, brother of the procurator, brother of the procurator of that name, Signor Bragadino, brother of the procurator of that name. He was famous in Venice for his eloquence, his great abilities as a statesman, and the amorous adventures which had distinguished his tumultuous youth. But he was now living quietly as an amiable philosopher. He had two affectionate friends, those who were now at his bedside, Signor Dandolo and Signor Barbo. Signor Bragadino was handsome, learned, and endowed with a good sense of humor. He was then only 50 years old. The doctor who had undertaken to cure him was named Terro. For some reason, he decided he could save him by placing a Mercury plaster on his chest. By midnight, the senator was flushed and in a state of extreme agitation. I approached him and saw that he was hardly able to breathe. I woke up his two friends and told them he would die if he were not immediately delivered from the fatal Mercury plaster. I removed it without waiting for their reply, washed his chest with warm water, and within 3 minutes we saw him breathing easily again. The three of us then went back to sleep. The doctor came early the next morning and was delighted to see that his patient had made such good progress. But when Signor Dandolo told him what had been done, he became angry and asked who had dared to discontinue his treatment. At this point, Signor Bragadino woke up. Doctor, the man who delivered me from the mercury that was choking me is a better physician than you are. He pointed to me as he said this. I maintained a modest silence while the doctor looked at me with mingled embarrassment and anger, judging me, no doubt, to be some bold impostor who had dared to supplant him. He finally turned to Signor Bragadino and told him coldly that he yielded his place to me. He was taken at his word. He left, and I found myself the personal physician of one of the most illustrious members of the Venetian Senate. I confess that I was delighted. I told my patient he required nothing but rest and careful diet. I told my patient he required nothing but rest and careful diet. The dismissed physician told the story all over Venice. When the patient was well, on the road to recovery, one of his relatives came to tell me that everyone was amazed that he had chosen a fiddler as his physician, but Signor Bragadino told them a fiddler might know more than all the doctors in Venice, and that, if it had not been for me, he would have choked to death. He and his two friends listened to me as though I were an oracle. Their credulous confidence gave me courage. I dogmatized and quoted authors I had never read. One day, Signor Bragadino, who had a passionate interest in the occult sciences, told me I seemed too learned for such a young man, and that I must therefore be in possession of something supernatural. He begged me to tell him the truth. Not wishing to hurt his vanity by telling him he was mistaken, I rashly told him an exaggerated lie. In the presence of his two friends, I told him that I possessed a method of computation whereby I could transform any question into numbers and obtain a reply also in numbers, which would tell me anything I wanted to know. Signor Bragadino told me it must be Solomon's key, commonly known as the Cabala. He asked me who had given me this knowledge. An old hermit who lives on Carpegna mountain. I replied. I met him while I was in the Spanish army. You have a real treasure, he said, and you can draw enormous profit from it any time you choose. I don't know how I could profit from it because the answers it gives me are sometimes so obscure that I have become disgusted with it and almost never use it. Signor Dandolo asked me to answer a question to which he alone knew the answer. Gladly, I said, for, having rashly committed myself, I had no choice but to brazen it out. He wrote down the question and gave it to me. I knew nothing about the subject, but that did not matter. I had to give an answer, since his question was so obscure to me that I did not understand it. It was only natural that I should not understand the answer either. I therefore replied with 4 verses which he alone could interpret. He read and reread them in amazement. He understood everything. It was divine, unique, a treasure from heaven. The numbers were only a vehicle. The reply had to be the work of an immortal intelligence. Signor Dandolo was so satisfied that his 2 friends also wanted to try my oracle. They asked me questions on all sorts of subjects, and my answers, which were meaningless to me, all seemed divine to them. They asked me how long it would take to teach them the rules of my sublime system of computation. I can't teach it to you very quickly. I can teach it to you very quickly, gentlemen. I said, I can. And I will be glad to do it. The Hermit told me I'd drop dead within 3 days if I ever shared my knowledge with anyone. But I don't believe in his threat. Signor Bragadino told me seriously that I ought to believe in it, and from then on none of them ever mentioned the subject to me again. They no doubt felt that, if they could attach me to them, it would be the same as possessing the knowledge themselves. They were all 3 honorable and charming men, but they were not wise, for they enthusiastically believed in all sorts of occult and illusory sciences. They believed in all sorts of occult and illusory sciences. After testing my cabalistic science with questions about the past, they decided to make use of it by consulting it about the present and the future. It was never in difficulty because I always gave answers with a double meaning, one of which could be explained only after the event. In this way, my Cabala, like the Delphian oracle, was never wrong. I realized then how easy it had been for the pagan priests of antiquity to deceive an ignorant and therefore credulous world. I saw how easy it will always be for impostors to find dupes, and I understood better than the Roman orator how it is possible for 2 soothsayers to look at each other without laughing. It is because they both have an equal interest in giving importance to the deception from which they profit. I spent my time pleasantly with my 3 venerable eccentrics, although insatiably thirsty for knowledge. They sometimes obliged me to work with them for as much as 10 hours a day. I admit that my conduct was not honest in every sense of the word, but if the reader to whom I make my confession is well acquainted with the world, if he will reflect before judging me, he will perhaps not refuse me a certain indulgence. I will be told that, if I had wanted to remain within the bounds of strict morality, I would have either declined to become involved with my 3 gentlemen or admitted that I had deceived them. I will not deny this, but I will reply that I had been earning my living as a fiddler, and that even if I had tried to cure them, I would not have succeeded, for they would only have laughed at me, deplored my ignorance, and eventually dismissed me. There is still another consideration, dear reader, and since I like you, I will tell it to you. My invincible self esteem alone would have been enough to prevent me from declaring myself unworthy of their friendship. Furthermore, it would have been discourteous of me to stop seeing them. If I choose what still seems to me the noblest and most natural course of action, I decided to place myself in a position which would ensure me against want. Everyone in Venice vainly tried to understand how such an intimate friendship could exist between me and three distinguished gentlemen who were noted for their austerity of their morals, while I was devoted to nothing except the pursuit of pleasure. By the beginning of summer, Signor Bragadino was well enough to return to the Senate. Here is what he said to me on the evening before he went there for the first time since his illness. Whoever you are, I owe you my life. I owe my life to you. Your other protectors who tried to make you a priest, a doctor, a lawyer, a soldier, and finally a fiddler, didn't know you. It was God who ordered your guardian angel to lead you to me. If you want to become my son, you have only to acknowledge me as your father, and I'll treat you as such for the rest of my life. Your apartment is ready. Have your belongings brought to it. You'll have a servant, a gondola of your own, and 10 sequins a month. You won't have to worry about the future. Amuse yourself, make me your advisor in everything, and rest assured that I'll always be your friend. I threw myself at his feet to show him my gratitude. He embraced me and called me his dear son. I promised him obedience and love. His two friends who lived in his house also embraced me, and we swore eternal brotherly love to one another. Such is the story of my metamorphosis, of the fortunate event which raised me from the base trade of fiddler and gave me the rank of a great nobleman. Rather rich, endowed by nature with a handsome and imposing appearance, an inveterate gambler, an incorrigible spendthrift, a loquacious and self-assertive talker. Rather rich, endowed by nature with handsome and imposing appearance, an inveterate gambler, an incorrigible spendthrift, a loquacious and self-assertive talker, nothing less than modest, intrepid, pursuing every pretty woman I met, supplanting all my rivals, and refusing the company of anyone who did not amuse me, I could not fail to be hated, but always ready to accept the consequences of my actions. I felt I had a right to do whatever I pleased. Such conduct was necessarily displeasing to the three honorable gentlemen whose oracle I had become, but they did not dare to tell me so. The kindly Signor Bragadino contented himself with telling me I was leading the same wild life he had led at my age, but that I must be prepared to pay the price and see myself punished for it when I reached his age. Without failing to show him the respect I owed him, I treated his terrible prophecies as jests and went on my merry way. In June, I went to the fair in Padua, where I made the acquaintance of a young man named Fabrice. In autumn, he introduced me to a family who had a country house near Zero, where we gambled, made love, and exercised our ingenuity in devising practical jokes to play on each other. Some of these jokes were rather crude, but everyone in the group had to take them good naturedly if he did not want the others to regard him as a bore. We made each other's beds collapse, imitated ghosts, gave diuretic pills to young ladies, and sometimes pills causing gaseous outbursts impossible to hold back. I was as hardened to these tricks as the others were, and equally active in devising them. But finally, I was the victim of an outrageous one whose unfortunate consequences put an end to the mania which we were possessed. I was as hardened to these tricks as the others were, and equally active in devising them. But finally, I was the victim of an outrageous one whose unfortunate consequences put an end to the mania with which we were possessed. Often we went to a farm that was 1.5 miles away if one took the usual path, but the distance was only half as great if one crossed a deep and muddy ditch by walking along a narrow plank placed over it. This was the route I always urged the others to take, since it frightened the ladies. I would always walk across first and then give them my hand. One fine day, the plank suddenly gave way beneath me, and I found myself up to my chin in foul-smelling mud. In spite of the rage I felt in my heart, I was obliged to join my artificial gaiety to the general laughter, which, however, lasted only an instant, for it was an abominable trick, and everyone recognized it as such. All my clothes were ruined. I laughed louder than anyone else, but I resolved to avenge myself as cruelly as I could. It was obvious that the plank had been sawed. I returned to town the next morning and came back to rejoin the merry company that evening. Fabrice told me that the perpetrator of the trick apparently felt guilty about it because he had not revealed himself. I promised sequin to a peasant girl if she could tell me who had sawed the plank. She found out that it was a certain young man whose name she told me. I went to see him, and another sequin made him tell me that he had been paid to do it by Signor Demetrio, a kind and amiable man of 45 or 50. Satisfied with my discovery, I racked my brain to invent a trick to play on him. In order for my vengeance to be complete, my trick had to be worse than the one he had played on me, but my imagination was unable to find anything satisfactory. A funeral finally solved the problem. Armed with a hunting knife, I went to the cemetery a little after midnight, dug up the dead man who had been buried that day, and, not without difficulty, cut off his arm at the shoulder. I then buried the body again and returned to my room with the severed arm. The next evening, after having supper with the whole company, I went to my room as though I were going to bed, but a short time later I took the arm into Demetrio's room. And hid it and hid. Next evening, after having supper with the whole company, I went to my room as though I were going to bed, but a short time later I took the arm into Demetrio's room and hid under the bed with it. A quarter of an hour later, he came in, undressed, blew out the light, and went to bed. I waited until he was beginning to fall asleep. Then I crouched at the foot of his bed and slowly pulled down the blanket. He laughed and said, "Whoever you are, go away and let me sleep. I don't believe in ghosts." He pulled the blanket back up and tried to go to sleep. A few minutes later, I began to pull down the blanket again. He tugged on it, repeating that he did not believe in ghosts, but this time I held it fast. He sat up to seize the hand holding the blanket, and I made sure he found the dead man's hand, thinking he had the man or woman who was playing the joke on him. He laughed and tried to pull the hand toward him. He held onto it for a few moments and then suddenly let go. He fell back and did not utter a word. I quietly slipped out of the room and went to bed. I was fast asleep when the sound of people hurrying to and fro awoke me early the next morning. My hostess, who was the first person I saw, told me my joke had gone too far. "What's wrong?" I asked. "Signor Demetrio is dying." "Do you mean to say I've killed him?" She went away without answering me. I was a little frightened, but I was determined to deny everything, no matter what happened. I went to Demetrio's room and found the whole company there. They all looked at me in horror and reproached me violently. I protested my innocence, but they laughed in my face. The archpriest and the beadle had been summoned. They refused to bury the severed arm and told me I had committed a serious crime. "I'm surprised," I said to the archpriest, "at the rash judgment that's been passed on me without any proof whatsoever." "It was you," said all my companions together. "No one else would have dared to do such a thing." "It's my duty to file a complaint," said the archpriest. "You're perfectly free to do so," I replied, "but I want you to know in advance that I'm not afraid of anything." At dinner, I was told that Demetrio had recovered the movement of his eyes, but that he was still unable to speak. I later learned that he remained feeble-minded and spastic for the rest of his life. His fate grieved me, but I consoled myself with the thought that I had not intended to do him so much harm, and that the trick he played on me might easily have been, or had cost me my life. Annoyed by all the reproaches to which I had to listen, I returned to Venice. 2 weeks later, I received a summons to appear before the blasphemy tribunal. I asked Signor Barbaro to find out the reason for the summons because it was a formidable tribunal. I was surprised that I should be treated as though it were certain. I was surprised that I should be treated as though it were certain that I had desecrated a grave, when in reality there could be no more than a suspicion that I had done so. But this was not the crime of which I was being accused. Signor Barbaro told me that a woman had accused me of raping her daughter. I was innocent of the charge of rape, but it was true that I had given the girl a sound thrashing. I drew up the following declaration and asked Signor Barbaro to give it to the magistrate's secretary. Declaration. I hereby declare that, having met Signora X with her daughter, I accosted them and invited them to enter a lemonade shop to take some refreshment. When we were inside, the girl rejected my advances, and her mother said to me, "She's still intact. She's right not to give herself to you without receiving something in exchange." "If that's true," I said, "I'll give you 6 sequins for her first fruits. You can make sure of it for yourself." said the mother. Having verified her statement with my hand, I told her I would have I would give her 6 sequins if she would bring her daughter to Zucca that afternoon. She accepted my offer. She accepted my offer with joy, brought her daughter to me, and left us in the garden together after I had given her the 6 sequins. When I tried to exercise the rights I had acquired, the girl, instructed, I think, by her mother, prevented me from carrying out my intentions. At first, this reluctance pleased me, but finally I told her seriously to put an end to it. She told me it was not her fault if I was unable to do what I wanted. Annoyed and angry, I placed her in a compromising position, but she forcefully moved away and made it impossible for me to do anything. I then picked up a broom handle which happened to be lying nearby and taught her a severe lesson in order to derive some satisfaction from the 6 sequins I had been foolish enough to pay in advance. But I was careful to chastise her only on the buttocks, where all the marks of my punishment will no doubt be found. The mother received her 6 sequins. The girl kept her detestable virginity, and if I have committed any crime, it is only that of having beaten a girl who is the infamous pupil of a still more infamous mother. My declaration had no effect because the magistrate knew the girl, and the mother laughed at having been able to dupe me. I disregarded the summons, and I was about to be arrested when I was accused before the same magistrate of having desecrated a grave. Because of its ecclesiastical importance, this second accusation was much more serious. Senor Bragadino advised me to flee. Finding this advice very wise, I began to make preparations for my departure without a moment's delay. I have never left Venice with greater regret, for at that time I was engaged in several extremely pleasant amorous intrigues, and my luck was good in gambling. My friends assured me that the 2 accusations would lapse into oblivion within a year at most, for in Venice anything can be settled peacefully after the public has forgotten about it. I left at nightfall, and the day I slept in Verona, and the next day I left at nightfall, and the next day I slept in Verona. I was alone and without letters of recommendation, but I was well supplied with money, in excellent health, and bowed down with the weight of 23 years. Chapter 7. When I reached Mantua, I took lodgings in an inn. I intended to leave within a short time to go on to Naples to see all my old friends there, but this plan apparently displeased my guardian angel. I would have left 3 days later if I had not decided to go to the opera. Toward the end of the performance, I was approached by a young man who told me straightforwardly that, since I was a stranger in Mantua, I should not fail to visit the museum owned by his father, Don Antonio Capitani. I have sinned only through ignorance, I replied, and if you'll stop by my inn for me tomorrow, you won't be able to reproach me for it again. He did as I asked, and I found his father to be an extraordinary eccentric. The treasures of his museum consisted of the genealogy of his family, books on magic, relics of saints, coins supposedly dating from before the flood, a model of Noah's Ark copied from the original, and a badly rusted old knife, which he claimed to be the one with which St. Peter cut off the ear of Malchus. You own this knife and you're not a millionaire? I asked. How could it make me a millionaire? In two ways. First, by putting you in possession of all the treasures hidden underground on the land owned by the church. That's natural because St. Peter has the key to them. And second, by selling the knife to the Pope himself if you have documents certifying its authenticity. I wouldn't have bought it without them. Excellent. In order to have this knife, I'm sure the Pope will make your son a cardinal, but you'll need the sheath also. I don't have it, but it's not necessary in any case. I can have one made. No, that won't do. You need the one into which St. Peter himself put the knife when God said to him, "Put up thy sword into thy sheath." It's still in existence, and it's in the hands of someone who can sell it to you at a good price, unless you'd rather sell him the knife, because the sheath without the knife is as useless to him as the knife without the sheath is to you. How much would it cost me? 1,000 sequins. And how much would he give me for the knife? 1,000 sequins. They both have the same value. It is not necessary for me to buy the sheath, or for your friend to buy the knife, because we can find the treasure together and divide it. Not at all. The knife and the sheath must be owned by one man. Do me the honor of coming back tomorrow, and we'll talk about a very important matter. I accepted his invitation and left, resolved to pursue the joke further. When I returned the next day, the first thing he told me was that he knew there was a treasure hidden in the papal states and that he had decided to buy the indispensable sheath. A certain man who owns a country house in the papal states, he said, is sure he has a treasure in his cellar. He's written to my son that he's prepared to spend all the money necessary to obtain it if he can find a magician skillful enough to locate it. His son took a letter from his pocket and read me several sentences from it, asking me to forgive him for not letting me read all of it, since he was sworn to secrecy. Without his noticing it, however, I had read the name of the place, Cesena, and that was enough. I myself am the magician he needs, I said, but you'll have to begin by paying me 500 sequins. I don't have that much money. Then sell me the knife. No. You're wrong to refuse, because now that I've seen it, I could take it away from you, and if I wanted to. But I'm too honest to do that. You could take my knife away from me? I don't believe it. All right then, tomorrow you'll no longer have it. An elemental spirit that I have at my orders will bring it to me at midnight, and the same spirit will tell me where your treasure is. Make it tell you that now, and I'll be convinced. Yeah, make it tell you that now. Let me have a pen and some paper. I consulted my oracle and made it reply that the treasure was beside the Rubicon. They looked in a dictionary and found that the Rubicon flows past the Seine. They were astounded, wishing to leave them free to reason badly. I left them. I had taken it into my head not to steal 500 sequins from those poor idiots, but to unearth that sum on the property of the other idiot in Cesena and have myself a good laugh at their expense. I was eager to play the part of a magician. I expected either the father or the son to come to see me the next morning. They both appeared. I told them I had decided to recover the treasure, and I promised them a quarter of it, provided they bought the sheath. I'll make up my mind when I see it, said Signor Capatini. I'll show it to you tomorrow, I replied, whereupon we separated, quite satisfied with each other. I had the shape of the knife in my hand. As I was thinking of how I could produce something suitable, I saw an old boot sole in the courtyard, and everything became clear to me. I boiled it and slit it open so that the knife would fit into it. Then I chewed it all over to make it unrecognizable and rubbed it with pumice, ochre, and sand. I finally succeeded in giving it such a ridiculous and ancient-looking shape that I could not help laughing. When I gave it to Signor Capatini and he saw that the knife fitted into it perfectly, he was overcome with wonder. We had dinner together, after which we agreed that his son would go with me to introduce me to the man on whose property the treasure was buried, that I would receive a bill of exchange for 1,000 piastres made out to his son, who would transfer it to my name as soon as I found the treasure, and that the knife in its sheath would come into my hands only when I needed it to perform the great operation. The son would keep it until then. We set out for Cesena, from where we went to the house of Signor Francia, the owner of the treasure, who lived a quarter of a mile outside the town. Our unexpected arrival was a pleasant surprise to him. I examined the members of his family and singled out his eldest daughter, whose name was Gina. I told her she must be 18, but she replied that I was seriously mistaken because she was only 14. Signor Francia paid me all the honors due a famous magician, although I did not look like one. We agreed that he would receive a quarter of the treasure, that another quarter would go to Capatini, and that the rest would belong to me. I told him I would require a room. With 2 beds and an antechamber with a bathtub. I added that he would have to find me a virgin seamstress between 14 and 18 years of age, but that she would have to be sworn to secrecy, along with all the servants in his house, so that the Inquisition would not get wind of anything. After supper, he told me that, with regard to the young virgin, he thought he had what I needed in the person of his daughter, Gina. Very well, I said. Then, deciding it was a good time to do something magic, I dipped a napkin in water and washed their eyes and temples with water, while uttering frightful words that were not part of any language. I made them all swear that they had no impure disease, and Gina had to swear that she was a virgin, which made her blush to the whites of her eyes. Next, I ordered them all to give me a kiss. When I smelled garlic on Gina's breath, I forbade them to eat it. Francia promised me I would never find it in his house again. I told Francia, Capatini, and Gina that they would each have supper with me in the order of their ages, and that Gina would always sleep in my antechamber, where there was to be a bathtub in which I would wash each guest half an hour before the meal. I made a list of all the objects I would need, gave it to Francia, and told him to buy everything at Athena the next day, but without bargaining over the prices. I wanted a large piece of white cloth, thread, a pair of scissors, needles, storax, myrrh, sulfur, olive oil, camphor, a ream of paper, pens, ink, 12 sheets of parchment, paintbrushes, and an olive branch from which I could make a wand, a foot and a half long. I gave my orders with great seriousness and without feeling the slightest inclination to laugh. I went to bed, delighted with my role and astonished to find myself so well suited to it. Francia came back from town at noon the next day with everything I had requested. I didn't bargain, he said, and I'm sure the merchant thought I was mad because I paid at least a third more than the things are worth. You'd have spoiled everything if you'd bargained with them. Send me your daughter and leave me alone with her. When she came in, I had her cut the cloth into 7 pieces to make the robe I was to wear during the great operation. Sit down beside my bed, I told her, and begin to sew. Sew. You'll have dinner here and remain until evening. When your father comes in, you will leave us alone, but come back and go to bed as soon as he's gone. Her father came in toward nightfall, and she left. I had the patience to wash him in the bathtub. We then had supper together, after which he went to bed and slept soundly until his wife brought me my chocolate the next morning. Gina came in and sewed all day until the arrival of Capatini, to whom I gave the same treatment as Francia. Gina came in and sewed all day until the arrival of Capatini, to whom I gave the same treatment as Francia. The next day it was Gina's turn, and this was the goal of all my labors. When the time came, I said to her, "Go get into the bathtub and call me when you're ready, so that I can purify you as I did your father and Capatini." She did as I said and called to me a quarter of an hour later. I washed her all over in every position, for she was perfectly docile. Afraid that I might betray myself, however, my suffering was greater than my pleasure. My indiscreet hands explored her entire body with special attention to a certain very sensitive spot, and the poor girl found herself in the grip of an agitation which was eventually soothed by the same thing that had aroused it. I made her get out of the bathtub a few moments later, and since I had to dry her in all positions, I was on the verge of forgetting magic and abandoning myself to nature. But then nature relieved itself of its own accord, and I was able to finish the scene without bringing it to climax. I told her to get dressed. When I was alone with her after supper, I said, "Tell me, Gina, were you displeased by what I made you do?" "No, not at all. I enjoyed it." "Then I hope that tomorrow you won't mind getting into the bathtub with me and washing me the way I washed you today." "I'll be glad to, but I'm not sure I'll know how to do it." "I'll give you instructions, and from now on you'll sleep in my room, because I must make sure for myself that you'll be in the right condition on the night of the great magical operation." She went to bed, and since she knew that she no longer had anything new to show me, her modesty did not suffer from being obliged to undress in front of me. She got up at dawn and went to work. As soon as she had finished my robe, I had her make me a parchment crown with 7 big points, on which I painted awesome-looking figures. That evening I got into the bathtub, and Gina came into it with me when I told her to. She conscientiously washed me as I had washed her the day before, and did it as gently and graciously as she could. I spent a pleasant hour in the bathtub, enjoying everything but respecting the essential. My kisses gave her pleasure, and she began kissing me all over as soon as she saw that I did not forbid it. But I put her at ease by telling her that the success of the great magical operation depended on the degree of pleasure she would take without constraint. She made incredible efforts to convince me she was happy without having gone past the limit I had established. We got out of the bathtub, highly satisfied with each other. At bedtime, she said, "Will we spoil the operation if we sleep together?" "No, my dear," I answered, "as long as you're a virgin on the day of the great operation, that's all that matters." When she heard these words, she threw herself in my arms, and we spent a charming night during which I admired the richness of her temperament and the restraint of mine, for I had enough self-control not to break through the barrier. The operation had to take place on the following day, for otherwise, in accordance with the accepted ideas on the subject, I would have been obliged to wait for the next full moon. The purpose of the incantations would be to force the gnomes guarding the treasure to push it up to the level of the ground directly beneath me. The purpose of the incantations would be to force the gnomes guarding the treasure to push it up to the level of the ground directly beneath me. I knew, of course, that the operation would fail because but I also knew that I would be able to give reasons that would satisfy Francia and Capatini. Meanwhile, I had to go on playing the part of a magician which delighted me. I knew, of course, that the operation would fail, but I also knew that I would be able to give reasons that would satisfy Francia and Capatini. Meanwhile, I had to go on playing the part of a magician, which delighted me. I told Gina to sew 30 sheets of paper into a circle, after which I painted bizarre figures on them. Next, I made a magic wand from the olive branch, which Francia had brought back from Siena, which he had brought back from Siena. Francia, he brought it back. Thus prepared, I told Gina that when I came out of the magic circle at midnight, she was to be ready for anything. She did not receive this order with repugnance, for she was eager to give me that proof of her obedience, and I was eager to satisfy her. When the time came, I ordered Francia and Capatini to stand on the balcony to prevent any other members of the household from seeing what was about to take place. I divested myself of all profane garments, and on my great surprise, when the time came, I ordered Francia and Capatini to stand on the balcony to prevent any other members of the household from seeing what was about to take place. I divested myself of all profane garments and donned my great surplice, made by pure hands of a virgin. I then placed the magic circle around my shoulders, took the magic wand in one hand and the wondrous knife in the other, and went down into the courtyard. There, muttering barbarous words, I spread out my circle, walked around it 3 times, and then leapt into the middle of it. Right in the middle. After squatting motionless inside the circle for 2 minutes, I stood up and looked at a large cloud that was rising above the eastern horizon as thunder began to rumble out from the same direction. How sublime I would have appeared to my idiots if I had noticed the state of the sky a short time before I predicted thunder. The cloud spread with extreme rapidity, and the sky was soon covered with a shroud ripped in all directions by brilliant flashes of lightning. This was quite natural, and I had no reason to be surprised by it, and yet a nascent fear made me feel the need to be in my bedroom. This fear soon became more intense as I saw the lightning surrounding me on all sides, for I conceived the idea, rather, that the only reason it did not strike me was that it could not penetrate my magic circle. Thus I worshipped the work of my own hands. This stupid reason prevented me from leaving the circle in spite of the fear which made me shiver inside of it. Otherwise, I would not have remained there for an instant, and my hurried flight would have opened the eyes of my two dupes. The violence of the wind, the resounding claps of thunder, the penetrating cold, the cold penetrating, the penetrating cold, and my own terror made me tremble like a leaf. My philosophical system, which until then I had believed to be impervious to everything, had vanished. The violence of the wind, the resounding claps of thunder, the penetrating cold, and my own terror made me tremble like a leaf. My philosophical system, which until then I had believed to be impervious to everything, had vanished. I now recognized a vengeful God who had waited for me there to punish me for all my wicked deeds at once and put an end to my unbelief by annihilating me. The absolute motionlessness in which I found myself convinced me that my repentance was to no avail, and this increased my profound consternation. The violence of the wind, the resounding claps of thunder, the penetrating cold, and my own terror made me tremble like a leaf. My philosophical system, which until then, my philosophical system, until then, I had believed to be impervious to everything, had vanished. I now recognized a vengeful God who had waited for me there to punish me for all my wicked deeds at once and put an end to my unbelief by annihilating me. The absolute motionlessness in which I found myself convinced me that my repentance was to no avail, and this increased my profound consternation. Eventually, the thunder died away. An abundant rain began to fall, and I felt my courage returning. Such is man. As soon as the rain stopped, the wind and the clouds vanished, and the moon came out in all its beauty. I picked up my magic circle and went to my room after ordering the two friends to go to bed without speaking to me. After 8 hours of sleep, with my mind rested, I found myself disgusted with the whole comedy, and when Gina appeared, I was surprised to notice that I felt no emotion. The docile girl had not changed, but I was no longer the same. In a state of apathy as a result of the superstitious ideas which my terror had inspired in me the night before, it seemed to me that her innocence was protected by heaven and that I would meet a prompt and terrible death if I tried to take it away from her. Now that Gina was nothing more than an object of holy dread in my eyes, I decided to leave immediately. Another thing which contributed to this decision was my apprehension that Some devout peasant might have seen me performing my antics in my magic circle, and that the Inquisition, informed of my pious zeal, might seize me and make an example of me by exhibiting me in a fine auto de fe in which I had no desire to play the leading part. AUTO-DA-F accentego E. Impressed by this possibility, I summoned Franthea and Capitini and told them I had obtained all possible information from the 7 gnomes guarding the treasure, but that they had forced me to postpone its extraction. I made Franthea swear to wait for me and never to trust anyone else claiming to be a magician, even if he should not see me or hear from me for 10 years, because, I said, according to the agreement I've made with the guardian gnomes, at the first attempt made by anyone other than myself, the treasure will sink down twice as deep as it is now, and in that case it would be 10 times more difficult for me to bring it back to the surface. I cannot tell you exactly when I'll return, but remember that your treasure cannot be extracted by anyone but me. I accompanied my instructions with maledictions, threatening the ruin of his entire family if he did not keep his oath. In this way I made up for everything because, far from duping the good man, I protected him in advance against any swindler who might be more interested in his money than in his daughter. I never saw him again, and he must be dead by now. But if I am right about the impression I made on his mind, his descendants must still be awaiting my return, for my name must have remained immortal in that house. As for you, I said to Capitini, go to Thethena and wait for me at the inn. Seeing that poor Gina was inconsolable, I took her aside and told her she would see me again before long. I added that, since the great operation had been successfully carried out, her virginity was now useless, and she could get married any time the opportunity presented itself. I immediately went into town, where I found Capitini ready to return to Mantua. Weeping like a simpleton, he told me his father would be filled with despair when he saw him come back without St. Peter's knife. I'll give it back to you, along with the sheath, I said, if you'll give me the 1,000 piastres for which the bill of exchange is made out. Finding this bargain extremely advantageous, he accepted it with joy. I gave him the bill of exchange and made him sign a note agreeing to give me back my sheath as soon as I paid him the same sum, for which he is still waiting. I had no use for the wondrous sheath, and I did not need the money, but I felt I would be dishonoring myself if I gave it to him for nothing. I hope the reader will find that I terminated my adventure in magic in a noble manner. I am quite proud of it, but I do not care to boast about it too much, because I think that if I had not been well supplied with money, I might have ruined poor Franthea while laughing at him. As for Capitini, to whom I sold the sheath to St. Peter's knife for the little money that it was worth, or for a little money, or for a little more than it was worth. As for Capitini, to whom I sold the sheath to St. Peter's knife for a little more than it was worth, he believed he was duping me by accepting it, and for the rest of his life his father valued it more highly than if it had been the finest diamond in the world. He died with this belief and therefore died rich, while I shall die poor. Let the reader judge which of us made the better bargain. My intention was now to go to France. I stayed briefly in Turin, where my peace of mind was not troubled by any amorous adventures, except for an incident with my laundress's daughter. I will recall it here only because it increased my scientific knowledge in a singular way. This girl was very pretty, and although I was not exactly in love with her, I did want her to grant me her favors. Goaded by my unsuccessful efforts to obtain a rendezvous with her, I ventured one day to obtain it with a little violence at the foot of a concealed staircase that she climbed to go to my room. I hid there at a time when I knew she was about to come. I seized her by surprise, and half as the result of persuasion and half because of the vigor of my approach, she was soon in the right position and I was in action. But at the first movement of our union, my ardor was dampened a little by a loud explosion, especially since she put her hand over her face as though to hide her shame. I reassured her with a tender kiss and began again. This time a noise even louder than the first one struck my nose and my ears at the same time. I continued. Each movement was accompanied by a new explosion, with the regularity of a metronome. This strange phenomenon, the poor girl's embarrassment, our position, everything struck me as so comical that laughter forced me to abandon my efforts. Ashamed and disconcerted, the girl ran away and I did not try to make her stay. I sat on the stairs for over a quarter of an hour after she had left, thinking about the comicality of the scene, which still makes me laugh when I remember it. I think the girl's virtue was caused by her strange defect. If all women had it, virtue would probably be much more common than it is, for an assault on the sense of hearing and the sense of smell is too high a price to pay for a moment of pleasure. I went to Lyon and spent a week there. Then I left for Paris in a carriage with 7 other people. We were all uncomfortably seated because the body of the carriage was oval-shaped, so that no one had a corner seat. Furthermore, the singular movement of the vehicle produced on me the same effect as the rolling of a ship in a heavy sea. This made me rather bad company, but no one said so. I was in France and with Frenchmen who were experts in the art of politeness. They contented themselves with saying that I had had too much supper, and a Parisian priest, taking my defense, said that I had a weak stomach. If this gave rise to an argument, "Gentlemen," I said impatiently, "you're all wrong because I have an excellent stomach, and I haven't had any supper at all." At these words, a middle-aged man gently told me I ought not to have told the gentlemen they were wrong, but rather that they were not right. Is not that the same thing? Then he launched into a long dissertation on politeness and finished by asking me, You're Italian, are you not, Monsieur? Yes, I am, but please tell me how you knew. By the attention with which you listened to my long harangue. Everyone burst out laughing, charmed by his originality. I entered into friendly conversation with him, and he gave me lessons in French politeness during the rest of the journey.